All right. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're located. Thanks for joining the Automobility Advisors webinar on Chinese electric vehicles. The Middle Kingdom charges up. We have some guest panelists today that I'll be happy to introduce. But first of all, my name is George Ayers. I'll be the moderator. I'm the managing director of Automobility Advisors, a boutique consulting firm focused on connected vehicles, mobility, and all things automotive technology. I have with me today some of our team members. First of all, Dan Teeter, Advisory Director. Welcome, Dan. Alan Levinson, Director of Data and Analytics. Welcome, Alan. Chip Getzinger, our Solutions Director. Welcome, Chip. Cap Shaw, Principal Consultant. Welcome, Cap. And Hayden Teeter, Head of Market Research. Welcome, Hayden. So we're going to try and step you through maybe a couple of ideas about Chinese electric vehicles. First, basically extracts from the white paper that we produced last month. So if you go to automobilityadvisors.com, you can download the white paper directly and get some of that background information on this topic. So this is, let's say, a high-level summary of that, just to ground everybody if you haven't had a chance to look at that. And then a discussion really is the heart of our meeting, to have a discussion about all the issues related to this topic. And then we'll reserve some time for questions from the audience. And we would ask you just to put those questions in the chat along the way. And our team will pull some of those questions out towards the end, and we'll try to answer those. So thank you again for joining, and away we go. So the first thing to talk about is the rise of Chinese vehicles and the adoption of Chinese electric vehicles within China itself. We'll talk a little bit about the history of the marketplace, history of the Chinese automotive market. But you can see just on this simple graph over the last decade plus where China has grown on electric vehicles, right? Quite significantly relative to other markets. There's been also, of course, a lot of strategic investment into China by European and American companies and other companies with joint ventures, et cetera. There's US brands that have been sold in China for many years. But of course, China has really focused on recently electric vehicles, and that's one of the topics for today. And of course, the other issues around that, strategic issues, let's say, are things like supply chain and elements and minerals and rare earth minerals and things like that that are dominated by the Chinese market at the moment. So what is the impact on the global automakers at the moment, right? So some brands, in fact, many brands, Tesla, Volkswagen, others, depend on the Chinese market, the internal Chinese market themselves, of course, for their sales, right? Many of their vehicles are sold, sometimes half as many or half their vehicles are sold in China. Of course, there's a lot of competitive pressure within China. Right now, China's actually got a bit of a slowdown on overall market. They have a extra supply of internal combustion engine vehicles, and they have a really strong capability to export, as we said, electric vehicles. So, it's a big global marketplace. It's a big automotive marketplace, and we need to kind of pay attention. And that's really what we're thinking about on this webinar. So the other things we want to get into today in our discussion is kind of the technologies that have emerged that China's starting to dominate, some of the resource issues, as I mentioned, and then maybe some of the standards that are happening. China has explored the European market quite aggressively and very successfully. We feel they're also going to try and do some of the same things in the US market, which will be the bulk of our discussion. But one of the ways they do that is with features and value, not just low price, but value, which is a combination of features and price, right? And then there's a whole other set of topics around consumer perceptions of Chinese brands. We have some examples of that today in the US, variations of vehicles that are built by China. Even General Motors, right, has vehicles that are built by China. Polestar is a good example, right? Vehicle sold in the US that's Chinese made. But the Chinese brands themselves will start to be front and center for US customers, for example. Regulatory hurdles, there's lots of discussion at the moment about limiting software from Chinese vehicles, limiting connected vehicle capabilities from Chinese vehicles, and we need to think about that a little bit. And then, of course, the market dynamics. How does the US or other competitors in Europe respond? How do they respond to the Chinese brands, the Chinese offering, Chinese solutions? And how are they adapting to this, right? And then lastly, thinking about kind of global expansion of these Chinese brands. Where do we see some of this going? How are they going to do that? How are they going to overcome these maybe legacy branding issues? And then how does this, help sustainability over time? It's maybe a very positive thing for the globe, let's say, with more EVs out in the world, but it's not going to be an even activity. There's going to be some winners and some not so much winners along the way, right? So I'll leave this up for a moment. This is a easy, fast way on your smartphone to access the white paper that we're referencing. You can download that. I think there's 30 pages or so of facts and figures. Thank you very much to the team here on the call, which pretty much produced that white paper for that. And with that, we'll go to the next idea, and that is I want to do a short little poll. We have a poll that I'd like to just try and see if you can respond to. There we go. So hopefully everybody can see that. If you want to answer the 3 questions there on the poll, we'll end the poll and see where everybody came out on these questions. And they're really 3 questions. Do you think Chinese electric vehicles will be a factor in the US market in the next 3 years? We had to kind of pick a time frame. We'll see if that's short or long for you. Would you consider buying or leasing a Chinese-made electric vehicle, right? Yourself. And then do you think automakers selling in the US market are ready to compete with Chinese EVs? We know product life cycles in automotive and how long it takes to build a car. Many of us on this call have worked inside OEMs and worked on car programs. So 3 years is not very long, even if we started tomorrow. So I think that's really interesting to think about. So I'll give everybody a few more seconds and we'll see. We have about 80% participation at the moment. So if we have a few more seconds, we'll try to get a few more entries and then we'll end the poll. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's see where we came out. So on the first question, 70% of you think that Chinese electric vehicles will be a factor in the US market in the next 3 years. So the majority of people on this call think this is going to be the situation. Number 2, would you consider buying one? 65%, I would say almost 2/3 of the audience here would consider buying a Chinese-made electric vehicle. That's really interesting. And then do you think automakers selling in the US market are ready to compete with Chinese EVs? Vast majority of you said no. So therein lies, I think, the opportunity for people in this business, people in automotive technology to help OEMs get ready, understand, think about, make some plans, do some things for the Chinese market. Great, super, thanks for that, really helpful. Why don't we kick it off in the discussion period a little bit here internally with just some level setting on the basics of the Chinese market, where it's been, maybe where it is, before we kind of start talking about where it's going. So I know a couple of folks on our team have done a lot of work on that front, understanding where China is and has been. Cap, why don't we kick us off on the history of the Chinese market? Maybe you can say a few words on how China's developed over the last 20 years, 30 years as a car market to put itself in a position to be in a maybe perhaps dominant place on electric vehicles in particular.
Yeah, absolutely, George. And I think it's prescriptive to start pretty much at the beginning, long before EVs were ever a factor. If you think about China in the 70s into the 80s, at that point, when you think of a Chinese car, it really was just a Soviet-derived car. The partnerships with the USSR back then, that's really what defined the automotive industry in China. The first major inflection point really came around 1984 when Volkswagen made this at that time a very polarizing decision to enter the Chinese market. And they did so with a product called the Volkswagen Santana. Now, what really made this notable is the fact that that product was built in China, so local production with a joint venture partner with a domestic brand. That was a very novel idea, but looking back now, that was really what set the Chinese market on a certain path, a certain collision course, so to speak, for decades to come. After Volkswagen made that strategy, they weren't the only ones that entered, as we know now, right? I mean, there was other brands like Jeep, Peugeot, Suzuki, Mitsubishi that entered. Many other brands entered the Chinese market with a very similar type of structure, joint venture with a local partner with local production, right? So that's really what kickstarted the modern era of Chinese automotive market. Now, eventually, that led to such specialization that there was even vehicles that were specifically tailored for the Chinese market, or even developed solely for the Chinese market. Some examples: Audi made a number of products in a long wheelbase fashion. So here in the U.S. and in Europe, we might know, okay, there's a long wheelbase A8, but in China, there's been a long wheelbase A4, A6, number of other products, even SUVs. They have long wheelbase version, and that's really tailored around the specific needs of the Chinese market as a chauffeur-driven type of market. There's also other vehicles like the Ford Taurus. It exited the U.S. market, but a subsequent current generation lives on for the Chinese market, right? So such a bread and butter American sedan like the Ford Taurus only exists in China, and that's really a remarkable turn from where that market started. But that's not really the only part of the story. Really, what led us to where we are is the fact that there's been a number of indigenous brands that have rose over that time. Brands like Chery, Geely, SAIC, and many others. And we'll talk about some of those other brands in this call here today. But they started off making copycat vehicles. There's been, some IP infringement, so to speak. There's been some remarkable coincidences in how some of these vehicles looked. But that's given way to a lot of experience that those brands have gained in terms of how to build low-cost vehicles. So that low-cost production, localized design. And in fact, that's really led to them being able to build their own products with their own design, sometimes even utilizing European design houses to style these vehicles. So there's a couple of other inflection points that happened after that. So 2009, that's where China became the largest marketplace in the world for automobiles, overtaking the US. That's kind of a remarkable shift from just 25 years earlier. But that wasn't the only change that happened. I mean, around by 2010, so just 1 year later, those domestic brands we talked about rose to become about 30% of the marketplace. And right around that time, or actually rather about a decade later, I should say, that's where things really started kick-starting where we are today. So that next major inflection point was what was called Xi Jinping's Made in China 2025. So this initiative had a number of things as part of it, but one of the major things there that's leading us to where we are today and where we're going to go was this mandate about EV leadership, right? So it wasn't just the fact that, hey, they're mandating that consumers buy EVs. It wasn't just that there's maybe some tax credits or rebates on EVs, but it was also that they were investing largely into battery production, supply chain, anything they could, to the tune of $15 billion or more, in order to make China competitive for EVs on a global scale. So it's not just for their own domestic market, but really for the global scale. And while we haven't seen that manifest itself yet in the US, we are seeing it in other parts of the world. Now, you take that on top of the fact that just around that time, so in 2022, domestic brands then became the majority of sales, right? So you take those two things together and the conditions became right for China to be able to take on the world in terms of EVs. So a couple of other, nuggets of information. The fact that 70% of battery production exists in China. So when we talk about supply chain, it really starts with the battery. There's more to it, but that is a major component when it comes to EV production and sales globally. Now, one of the other things that's happening is that those Chinese vehicles have started to advance so much, especially in the realm of EVs. We're actually seeing some notable things like in the Chinese market, there are Chinese EVs that are being rebadged as Hondas and Toyotas because those other brands that are selling in China, those Japanese and Korean and US manufacturers, can't develop EVs for the Chinese market quick enough to compete with the domestic brands that they actually have elected to rebadge in some cases. And when it comes to on a global scale, there's actually U.S. and other brands that are rebadging Chinese vehicles in other markets. One example is in Mexico. So Dodge had a rebadged vehicle called the Dodge Attitude, which was at one point was a rebadged Hyundai, at one point was a rebadged Mitsubishi, but the next generation coming out is actually going to be a rebadged GAC MPAL. So that's actually really notable that these global brands are electing to put their badge on a Chinese product in various different global markets.
Yeah, really interesting. And thinking about the China, Made in China 2025 plan, right? 2025 is right around the corner now. So this plan seems to have been on track. This is my conclusion. And I think that's really what we're talking about here. And then I'm wondering, Hayden Teeter, you did a lot of research kind of on the Chinese vehicles and competitiveness and features and things like that. Anything to add in terms of where we're at with Chinese vehicles from your point of view?
Yeah, Chinese vehicles have some really strong features that the US and European markets are still struggling to capture. Things like AI, where we still kind of aren't sure what that means. Chinese automakers have been able to implement that in a more concrete manner. Things like automated parking and autonomous drive, they've been able to actually deploy on the streets in China, where in the US it's still sort of caught up in regulatory purgatory, per se. So you have these advanced features that US and European, our legacy automakers are still working towards, where Chinese automakers have found ways to accelerate and get into those things and put them out on the street right now as viable products. And it's sort of propelled them to a new position in the market where they are now the cutting edge. And this has previously not been the case up until these last couple of years. And it'll be interesting to see if legacy automakers can find a way to catch up and cut through the regulatory tape in order to remain competitive.
Yep. Great. And what I'm thinking about is, the first kind of major region that China is trying to conquest was Europe, and that's been happening already. We're seeing that. There's a lot more EV penetration in some markets of Europe, of course, than the US. So there's already ready-made EV customers and buyers. Dan Teeter, you had been to Europe recently, I know. I think you even told me once you rented a Lincoln Co. once, maybe
That's
a year
correct.
ago. So you have some experience with Chinese EVs in Europe. You've been recently there. There's lots of infrastructure, perhaps, in some areas of Europe that's helpful for EVs, maybe not everywhere. How do you feel about what you see happening in Europe with Chinese EVs and their success? Certainly BYD, MG, all very successful in Europe so far, despite tariffs, things like that, right?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting about the expansion of Chinese vehicles into other markets, it's different than some of the other global expansion efforts in the first few years that have been really challenging for other OEMs. I'm thinking about when Yugo first came to the US, sold a ton of cars, really low price, really poor quality, disappeared within 3 or 4 years. Hyundai came in, also wasn't great quality, but they did a reset, they fixed it, and now they become a very powerful OEM. The Chinese aren't coming to these markets with garbage. They are coming with really, acceptable quality, highly advanced technology, and they're doing it at a low price. So you've got brands like MG that have gone from, a very traditional British brand to now being a challenger with Tesla for volume leader in Europe for EVs. That's unheard of. And they're a great new car. I think it's the Cyberster. It's harkening back to the roadsters of the past that made MG famous globally. That car's not even out yet to be a halo vehicle. Right now, they're fairly, unobtrusive styling. So they've been able to come into these markets in Europe, whether it's Lincoln Co., which is, rebadged, or maybe the Volvo version or Polestar type surrogates, or the rebadged vehicle. Very high quality, very competitive. You've got BYD that not only has competitive vehicles, they've got very elaborate and very nice showrooms in major markets whether it's in Italy or in Portugal, all across Europe, they're competing head to head with domestic and other global manufacturers' sales points. So it's not just the product that some of these brands have right. They also have the distribution right. And they'll be a formidable adversary in Europe, that's for sure.
Yep. And just also, I think Cap talked about the history of the Chinese market and where they are, and Hayden kind of talked about some of the features. There's that shift to EVs China made earlier than lots of other countries. You saw that in the first chart I shared. And then, of course, the government helps organize the local market for them to be, accessible for EVs. I read 2.6 million is the number of charge points in China, 2.6 million. US has 100,000 something. Radically different scale, right? So there's a lot of incentive for the local market to buy EVs. And then, of course, if there's a surplus of vehicles, then that's what you're going to send overseas. So they're going to get really good at it really fast because there's all these different moving pieces. All right, I want to talk a little bit about maybe some of the fundamental issues that we have to start to wrestle with, right, as Chinese vehicles come to the U.S. in particular. And that's some of the discussions that we've seen this year about privacy, data security, software and hardware, connected vehicles, those kinds of things. And I'm just wondering, Chip Getzinger, if you have a point of view on where that is, because it's not just security, it's more than that. The Commerce Department, I think, has floated the proposal to limit or eliminate software and hardware for connected vehicles from Chinese brands, for example. Those things aren't real yet, but they're being talked about. We got a new administration coming. So lots of things can happen. How do you feel about these issues? Data privacy, security, software more important than ever, right? So how do we think about that with the Chinese brands, Chinese companies?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's an issue and a concern. I mean, we already know it's an issue and concern in the industry anyway. Even putting aside the Chinese EVs coming into the market, in our last webinar a couple of months ago, we talked about, data monetization and security privacy issues around that and some of the challenges that GM has had recently as a domestic maker in that space. But when you get the Chinese makers involved, it adds another level of complexity. So we already know there are concerns at the governmental level about the security of any sort of connections with China. The ongoing debates about TikTok and trying to get them to divest the Chinese ownership and become an American-owned company to protect data privacy and banning it from use in governmental devices. And of course, there are a lot of discussions around the same sorts of issues with Chinese connectivity in vehicles, and particularly in their EVs. So the Chinese EV manufacturers are facing sort of two aspects of challenge here. One is the actual protection of security and data privacy, ensuring that they are not going to be compromising customer data or acting as an agent of the Chinese government, which is a big investor in the EV manufacturers. But there's also a perception issue. So even if they are agreeing to do the right things, and that's an if, making sure that people have the confidence, the trust that they are doing so, that they are doing the right things, that they are protecting the data, that they are protecting the security of the vehicles, because these connected vehicles are, quite complex and quite sophisticated at this point. So it's not just the data that they can get from the vehicles, which includes things like geolocation, which means based on where the car parks all the time, they probably know where you live and where you work and places that you spend time frequently, what your calendar is, what your schedule is, which could be a security risk if you're somebody in the government or a position of authority. But there are now so many cameras in the vehicles that they can also get lots of other data. And of course, your vehicles and your smartphones become more and more intertwined these days. And as soon as they get access to a companion app on the smartphone or a smartphone that is paired with the vehicle, you now have risk of access to all of the data and information you've got in your smartphone. So there's a ton of risk here. So like I said, they've not only got to get practices in place to ensure that all of these aspects are protected, but they need to ensure that the way in which they do it is credible and is transparent and is understandable by people to whom they're marketing these vehicles, so that there's a level of trust there. And that probably means that it's not sufficient for them internally to go, here are the practices that we're going to put in place, and tell everybody, yes, this is what we're doing, please trust us. That's probably not going to get it done, right? They're going to need to have third-party validation of the credibility of the practices that they're putting in place. And that might mean some combination of third-party security companies doing pen testing and evaluation of their systems. It might mean something like ISO certifications, like ISO 27001, or other similar types of certifications maybe that will need to be developed. But I think it's pretty clear that if they want to develop that public trust here in the US, that they are putting all the practices in place, they have to do it, which is complex and requires a lot of work to ensure that you're properly isolating and protecting all the information. But two, they've got to figure out what credible third parties can certify for them that these things are being done properly. So there needs to be somebody else in a position of trust who can say, yes, we've gone through this, we've tested it, we've validated it, we have understood the practices of the company, we know where they're storing the data. Maybe their data gets stored onshore and doesn't get shipped back to China. Here's how we ensure that. But they're going to need to address both the reality and the perception of security and privacy.
Yeah, it's interesting. For many years we've talked about connected vehicles in China having to kind of, house all the data in China, right? You can't really export it. And I was reading in our materials and other materials about Chinese companies saying the same thing about Europe, right? We'll keep it in Europe, we'll keep it in the US, we won't export it. So they're trying to do now, they have to do kind of the same thing. But there's a lot of intertwining, right? There's a lot of Chinese software that other companies use that aren't Chinese, right? And because of global development that's happened, there's, PR issues like Chinese weather balloons flying over the US that are going to make people think about things like this. So it's very interesting that it's kind of come around full circle from, China was a kind of a closed market and you had to operate with a JV and you had to keep all the data there. And now that's different. They have to kind of deal with our market as well and our issues, which is interesting.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see if they need to look at that same model in reverse, right? In order to engender more trust and to be clear about how they're managing things within the region and not shipping it back to China, they might need to look at JVs with US companies so that the control and management of these critical items is done by US-based companies and US-based personnel that have some control and some ability to tell the market, look, this is all being managed by Americans here in the US, and this isn't all immediately being shipped overseas.
Yeah.
So there are some ways they could go about doing this, but it's a challenge they're going to need to address.
Yeah. So let me also now turn a little bit to kind of the retail approach. We had 85% of our poll respondents say that the US OEMs or the OEMs in general are not ready yet for Chinese vehicles. I'd like to turn it to Alan Levinson. Alan, I know that you've driven a domestically badged Chinese vehicle, for example. You have some good firsthand knowledge. Have worked in the retailer side of the automotive business, worked in the OEM side. What's your thoughts and conclusions about the readiness, not just of the OEMs, but of the distribution systems, et cetera, right? We've seen, VinFast try to go distribute through dealers and go direct and kind of change its mind a little bit. Tesla goes direct. We've heard of agency models floated and some are going away right now, the more I read about it. So how do you feel about retailers or retailer readiness? The US, I think the EV readiness is still happening. There's, in my view, 1/3 of US retailers are EV fans and ready to go. 1/3 don't want anything to do with EVs and 1/3 are kind of in the middle. What's your conclusion about, the EV market for the US and particularly Chinese EVs in the US?
Yeah, no, good question. So, I mean, as I think about it, there's really three categories to think about. One is just will they have the permission, and Chip hit upon that. A, tariffs, will they be large enough that it actually makes it prohibitive? And B, will they just have the ability? So let's assume that they can get through that hurdle. The next question is sort of that branding, that image that you mentioned. Will people be willing to accept Chinese vehicles? Dan talked about any brand that comes new, any country, quite frankly, it takes a while to get accepted. Even the Japanese did. It wasn't right away. And certainly the Koreans, they finally came back with a 10-year warranty, and today have some of the best vehicles. I would argue VinFast probably isn't quite there yet on the quality, but who knows? Let's give them time on the next ones. I do think China does have an extra issue, given it is viewed by many as a country that's competitive with us. And to your example, I drive the Buick Envision, which is today one of 3 vehicles manufactured in China and sold in the US. This is my second one. My first one, several years ago, it was the only vehicle sold. I remember literally one day at the supermarket, and somebody sees it and says, "Oh, that's a nice car. What is it?" And I told them it's a Buick Envision. And I said, "Yeah, would you believe it's actually the only car sold in the US that happens to be manufactured in China?" And he responded, "No, no effing way I would ever buy one of those." So I do think there are challenges, but at the end of the day, I do believe Americans do believe in value. And if you manufacture a good vehicle that drives well with good quality at a good price, I do think there is an opportunity for them to make their way in. But again, that's given that other issue that we discussed with will they have the ability. The last piece on distribution, that one I think they can solve. You're right. My guess is they would probably want to go direct, just because all of the OEMs seem to believe and have a sense that it's a lower cost way. That is hard. You still do not have permission to do it in all 50 states. Tesla actually has been grandfathered in a number of states that none of the others, even Lucid and some of the others, are getting. So it's a challenge. Truthfully, maybe I've just drunk the Kool-Aid for too long. I do believe in the franchise dealer model, and that there's a lot of value to it. I think Tesla's success is not their distribution. I think their success is their really great vehicles with a terrific brand. And I would tell you their service is probably more of a negative for that. And my understanding is Rivian now has some dealerships, and that their market share is much stronger around where they do have a dealership and not. The last piece I'll say is, if they do want to come in through a more franchise dealer network, there are always plenty of dealers that are willing to try and take on new brands. That's never been an issue. There's always seems to be more subscription. Even Fisker, which obviously was not a good success, plenty of people were willing to try that. The last piece I'll make on that is, as we know, BYD is one of the strong players in China. As you might know, Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's group, has a pretty big investment in them. Berkshire Hathaway owns a very large dealer group in the US. What was the Van Tile group they acquired quite a few years ago. So that would be a very quick and easy mode of distribution for them. So my sense is that one, again, they might want to try to go direct, but either way, they'll be able to solve that problem.
Great, thank you. Also, want to come back a little bit to the, let's say, technology side of the features. There's been things that I've seen about the smartphone industry in China, kind of informing vehicle side. There's even a smartphone maker building cars or trying to build cars, kind of like Apple has been trying. And then NIO, I think it is, right, Cap? NIO offering a smartphone with its car kind of organized. So we talk a little bit about connected vehicles. It seems that the Chinese brands are really cooperating with the latest technology companies. I mean, China Unicom, China Mobile, China Telecom are gigantic phone companies globally, right? So they have a lot of advantages in the technology side, maybe AI as well. I don't know, Hayden or Cap, either one of you have any feedback on that linkage between smartphones and that tech industry and China EVs?
Yeah, George, I can comment on that. So, if you think about brands like Xiaomi, OnePlus, Huawei, and there's many others, but they've really done quite a great job, frankly, resetting consumer expectations on what a Chinese product is. Up until the rise of Chinese handset manufacturers, it's always sort of presumed that when you think of a Chinese product, you think of just something that's manufactured without a brand name, something that was just really competing on price only. And what those brands did is they still maintained the price competitive type of advantage, but they also added competition on technology and features. And frankly, not only can that strategy port over to automobiles, but like you said, there's even some of those brands themselves that are building cars. So you mentioned Neo, Xiaomi. There's that even leads to an association and opportunity for name recognition, right? So if you happen to have a Xiaomi phone, or if you know that Xiaomi makes phones, you might be more comfortable with buying an automobile made by Xiaomi. And any association with a high-tech, high-featured product is only a good thing for a new brand that is looking to launch in our marketplace.
Yeah, great. Anybody else comment on the intersection of latest technology and China EVs?
I guess I want to add a little piece here that I think that there's a cultural difference between, say, the US market and the Chinese market in the way that technology and vehicles are viewed. Where in the US, there's like this car culture that exists. I'm sure many in the audience would call themselves car enthusiasts, where there's been this long-standing car culture going back to the 19 teens, where we have our muscle cars and hot rodding and all this stuff, where there's cars as one area and then this new tech industry as another area. Where in China, there isn't 120 years of legacy automotive manufacturing. There is this rise of handset manufacturing first, and then cars are sort of tacked on, and then cars become this huge deal in China in the last decade and a half. And there's not this belief that there needs to be these car enthusiast, car culture tuned vehicles where it's completely acceptable for Xiaomi to manufacture a car. Everyone thinks that's really awesome because they make great phones. So they're totally willing to buy into this smart Xiaomi vehicle, where in the US, people like Apple doesn't make a V8. Apple doesn't make a car that appeals to the car enthusiast. I will never buy that. So there's a completely different mentality in China that allows them to sort of move in this direction where technology manufacturers can make EVs that actually appeal to a huge mass of the population, whereas in the US, that's sort of not as practical for cultural reasons.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I know, we talk about the Apple car that never happens, but the brand power of the tech brand is what you're kind of talking about. About 25 years ago, Samsung also announced it was going to make a car, which never happened, right? So, and it was a natural idea for their, as they moved up the ladder of all the different things they made, that was kind of the next step. But interesting where the consumer's head is at, right, in China. Let's get, go ahead.
Let me just spin on that for just a second.
Yeah.
And Hayden, I'm totally with you on the car culture here in the US. As you know, I'm very much somebody that would consider myself a car enthusiast as well. But I will say that as the generations progress, there's more of a shift to more of that Chinese mindset of tech focus and tech first and less of the car enthusiasm. Folks that you go to school with, went to school with, are more likely than folks than I went to school with to be more tech focused than vehicle focused. My kids are a lot less enthusiastic about vehicles for vehicles' sake than they are about than I was, and that they are about technology. So while there is that cultural gap, I think it's narrowing.
Yeah.
Right. And if I could just add to that, really where the war is today, with the Apples and the Googles, it's not the hardware, it's owning the customer experience in the vehicle, and a lot of battling with the OEMs and those over who owns the data, who owns the customer. That's really where they're putting their effort, and we'll see where that plays out.
And George, I want to pile on too, just because it
Sure.
wouldn't be right if I didn't, since everyone else has. As a former market intelligence guy before I became a connected car guy, one of the key things that we're talking around here is consumer preferences and segmentation. And there are different segments within the US market, just like there are different segments, I'm sure, within the Chinese market. We just happen to have a much larger car culture kind of segment in the US from decades of legacy, motorheads around this country that might not exist there. But you are seeing these different distinct segments that arise, and some are growing, some are shrinking. And the success of any of these brands, whether they're domestic or Chinese or other countries, their success is really dependent on understanding who those customers are, creating the features and the values that are most important to those customers, meeting their unmet needs, and who can deliver on them best is going to win with the highest market share and the best profitability.
Yeah. Great. I want to also touch on kind of the success to date of some of these Chinese brands. I don't think everybody's completely aware all the time of where they are. We had a chart in the white paper that was the market capitalization of automotive companies. And I believe Tesla was number one. It's about $1 trillion. Remember, they kind of crossed that hurdle, I think, in the last 12 months. Toyota number two, but BYD was number three, and Xiaomi was number four. So that's ahead of Ford, GM, Mercedes, Volkswagen, Ferrari. I mean, market cap is one measure, certainly not the only measure, but that's interesting. And then we also see lots of investments, not just in China, but around the world. I read this week that CATL, which is a battery maker, has made a deal with Stellantis to put a $4 billion battery factory in Spain, for example. My state of Georgia, there's an SK battery factory going up right now as we speak. Governor of Georgia is working real hard to get EV battery companies and EV companies to build in Georgia. Lots of factories. So, despite the press on EVs, there's still a lot of, I think, investment. We've read about Mexico and Canada as investment destinations for Chinese brands, right? I haven't heard definitively a site or a amount, but I think that's on the way. And then, of course, they could use the NAFTA kind of rules to ship into the US and benefit from that. Does anybody have any thoughts about just general scale investment issues around the Chinese brands? No, just me. Okay. Just kidding. All right. Well, why don't we do this? Why don't we turn to the audience? I think we have one question. I'll try to read it. This is from James. Do you foresee Chinese automakers utilizing US-based mobility models such as Uber and Lyft to introduce their vehicles to US consumers before transitioning them to traditional ownership? This could also extend to shared mobility options, including ride-sharing services and month-to-month leasing or rental programs. Very interesting question. So kind of first mover strategy in the US before they start delivering the real vehicles. Anybody like to comment on that question?
Yeah, sure, George. Frankly, that's in some ways that's just a distribution model, right? And I think that as the Chinese automakers are entering the US market, now they don't already have a whole franchise dealership system in place, right? So some of them may try the DTC modeling that your Rivians, Lucid, and Tesla do, right? That is certainly one option, but many of them probably will try partnering with other tech companies that already have some sort of distribution model, right? And in some ways, Uber can be a distribution model, right? So they certainly could do some of these ride-sharing type of models. They could do some of the short-term leasing, rental, whatever, right? There's plenty of different things that they will probably experiment with. The question is what will pan out, and we'll probably see a variety of different things that will ultimately lead to success. But certainly they will. I wouldn't be surprised to see them try these things.
Yeah, if I could throw something in there, as much of a question for me is whether Uber or Lyft would want to do this, at least initially, right? So as we talked about the fact that the Chinese brands need to gain trust and credibility here in the market, there's certainly a risk early on that Uber or Lyft instead would lose credibility and trust if they're working with a Chinese brand that hasn't yet demonstrated for US consumers that they are trustworthy and that their data is safe, et cetera. So it would be, I think it would take some work to work with Uber and Lyft to figure out how to ensure that using them as a way to get their models introduced, leveraging their reach to get customers more familiar with and comfortable with the vehicles in a way that doesn't actually impact Uber or Lyft's credibility negatively or trust negatively, because people going, oh, I called an Uber and they sent me this Chinese car that's going to steal all my data about my trip and my ride, and I don't like that, right? So there's, it's got to work on both sides.
But I would argue that, and the research I've seen is that most people don't care that much about the vehicle when they're doing a ride share. Just as with a bus, they probably aren't familiar with who even manufactured that bus. So cost is a huge issue right now, as we know, whether it's driven by partially by the subsidies, but a lot of it is now scale and lower cost. The Chinese are making the top quality vehicles, EVs, which are what are going into the fleets, and it will certainly, and the more so, particularly as we start getting into autonomy or various levels. So I think that cost opportunity and advantage will play a big role.
Also wondering myself, would you see any JV relationships, perhaps, right? In China, there are JV relationships because the government required that. Volkswagen, SAIC had to, they put things together. FAW, I think, as well. So they had to put things together or they couldn't compete. In the US, would it be to the advantage of perhaps an automaker to have a Chinese company as its partner, technology, et cetera, to share distribution, et cetera, et cetera? Automakers have done that before, right? They've worked together with other brands in trying to do that. Does anybody think that's even viable? Just curious.
I mean, George, when you think about, I cited that example earlier of how Dodge is rebadging a Chinese vehicle in the Mexican market, right? Now, if they did something like that in the US, where let's say a Chinese automaker wants to enter the US market, but they don't have a whole distribution model in place, right? But if they partnered up with one of the brands that's already here, sold cars from their showroom, and even rebadged it as that brand's vehicles, that would be an obvious opportunity to sell cars into the US market. Now, obviously, that doesn't do much to build their own brand, but maybe that's good enough depending on what their goals are.
Right.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting. There's enough automakers in the space right now that are struggling that certainly I think the Chinese makers could find somebody to link up with, right? Whether it's somebody they want to link up with or not is another question.
Right.
But the market has been really challenging, right? The industry is been in a tough spot the last few years. And given that challenge and that struggle and that shrinking market share that a lot of OEMs are seeing, I think it's certainly high probability that one or more of them would be willing to make a bet on working in a JV with a Chinese OEM, to help their own fortunes.
Yeah.
Probably a couple of things need to happen there as well. One is that the barrier to entry for a Chinese automaker coming to the US probably needs to be reduced. So there can't be really high tariffs or deep incentives for US and European automakers to set up shop and Asian automakers to set up shop in the US, but not allowing Chinese to do so. So that would probably need to change in order to get an OEM in the US to say, yeah, let's partner with China and BYD or another OEM. I don't think the quality of the vehicle or the features would be a problem.
Right.
In many cases, that's surpassing what's there already. But the other side of this we touched on earlier, it's just that the majority of the Chinese production is EV. The problem that's holding back more adoption, or one of the problems holding back more adoption in the US and Europe, is really charging infrastructure. The second part is price. China's got the vehicle price handled. Even with tariffs, they might still be able to undercut the local manufacturers. but there just isn't enough charging infrastructure for a customer who doesn't have a garage and a home charging station to feel confident in having an EV as their primary car in really high volume.
Right.
And that's a barrier that might reduce a company's willingness to partner with BYD or another one and do a JV here.
So we have a couple more questions from the audience. Our good friend Raul asked a question. I'll read it. Thank you, Raul. If the U.S. government intervenes and forces some kind of data privacy protection for U.S. consumers on Chinese vehicles, will that also affect U.S. OEMs? Will consumers change their behavior for a car in the context of we already give all our data to our phones? In other words, customers used to letting the phone have the data. What's the difference with the car, and how will U.S. OEMs? Anybody like to take a crack at that one?
Well, as I was talking about data, I can start with that. And that's Alan, he will want to jump in on as well, because we were the ones that worked on that white paper a couple months ago. I think it's a good point. And, we tend to think of, well, U.S. makers, but we're not, there aren't that many. Right?
Yeah,
Most of the volume
many
in the U.S. doesn't come from U.S. automakers, right? So if there are restrictions put on similar to the EU Data Act or something that require a lot of changes and protection for data stored here only in the US, it's not just going to impact Chinese automakers. And to some extent, it's going to kind of level the field for everybody who isn't already basing all their data processing here. I think it's a similar, your second comment, I'll kind of 2-for-1 it, similar kind of comment about the tariffs, right? If tariffs are going to be put on products coming in from Mexico and Canada, where lots of cars sold in the US are made, that's going to reduce the impact on the Chinese EV makers, because it's going to level the field, right? Only vehicles built in the US will then not be impacted directly by this, but a lot of the components that go into vehicles built in the US come from overseas. So if the tariffs are that broad, it ends up just sort of impacting everybody, and thus not being that much of a negative against any particular company.
It just could be a potential negative for all companies, because the size of the market might go from 16 or 17 million back down to 12 or 13 million, and that's not good for anybody.
Yeah.
Correct. But it won't unduly favor
Correct.
or disfavor anybody. It's going to hit everybody. It's just like a rising tide raises all ships, a lowering tide will sink them all, right?
Yeah, right. Ground them all. That's right.
Yeah. And Alan, if you want to talk about the data part, yeah.
Yeah, well, two things. First, before the data, let's not forget where I believe the incoming administration is thinking with all of these tariffs is what they're really trying to do is encourage manufacturing in the United States. And so, I think that's the goal. So we'll see where the tariffs end up, but I think what we'll probably start to see is more plans in the United States, and that very well could include Chinese, assuming the data issues. As for the data, that's a big issue regardless, as we put in the white paper a couple months ago. All of the domestic OEMs as well are struggling with how to properly use and quote monetize that data, and we know there's been some issues of late with GM and some others, but that's really the not issue for everybody.
All right, great. A couple more questions. We have about 6 minutes left. We'll try to answer them. Greg, thank you for your good question. He says, I think most people working in the industry understand the strengths of Chinese OEMs, but the general public has a very inaccurate and outdated understanding of Chinese OEM capability. Alan, you shared that story about your vehicle, right? How do you think how important do you think it is to educate the public on the actual situation and how that can be achieved? So how do we actually do that? Anybody have a comment on kind of educating the public on how modern and, capable Chinese vehicles are?
Yeah, George, I think that's one of those things where it's just going to be a proof is in the pudding type of issue. Frankly, it starts from having good product, right? So if they launch with good product and they have a good competitive price, then really it's just a matter of having branding that is going to be either add some comfort level to consumers or can quickly be perceived in a positive light, right? If like, let's say you take a vehicle like that Xiaomi SU7 that even Jim Farley was speaking positively of, right? It's a very good looking car, if something like that launched, it has the brand Xiaomi, people will likely be able to get comfort with that, knowing the association with handsets. If it's at a competitive price, it has all the features. I mean, it has, say, Apple CarPlay, Android Auto. There's nothing about the car that's going to feel low rent or just incompatible. There really isn't a reason for people to once they've experienced the car, seen it, there's no reason for them to have like a negative type of reaction to that vehicle, no matter where its origin is.
Okay,
And rest
great.
assured, Cap, that Super Bowl ad isn't going to look like it's a Chinese company.
Right, right.
Very true.
When they start
Right.
to talk about it, that's right.
Well, and getting people to experience it, I think it's what the Uber Lyft question was about earlier, really. How do you get people to experience that? And, lacking the ability to individually go out to everybody in the country and put them in a car and go, see, isn't this nice? Right. They've got to figure out some other way to generate trust. And maybe that's with, some sort of affinity marketing type of things. Like, the kind of the example that comes to mind is, Cadillac years ago was, struggling with being a brand for an older generation. And then suddenly the Escalade came in and it was being driven by, famous people in entertainment and in sports and, gaining credibility that way as these folks that people looked up to from a style and consumerism standpoint are going, hey, they like it. This must actually be pretty good. So I'm curious where the Chinese manufacturers might be able to get some folks who have, who are influencers in some fashion like that to say, much like Jim Farley, that's for us in the industry, that's a really credible sort of an endorsement to say Jim Farley thinks this is a great car, but your average person driving and buying cars doesn't know who Jim Farley is, but they know who LeBron James is. So, is there somebody else, some other media folks, entertainment folks, sports people, movie stars, whoever, who they could pull in and say, hey, drive these cars and, see that you really like them and that they're great vehicles, right?
Question from my good friend Alex. Thanks to Alex on charging plugs. We haven't talked about that. 2.6 million charge points in China. There must be some experience there. How would they think about the US market? Would they adapt to kind of what's going on here, come up with their own systems? Anybody have a point of view on that part of the EV equation?
I can chime in on that, George. We can see right now that NACS, North American Charging Standard by Tesla, that is winning the wars right now. So CCS was widely believed to be the one that was going to win the war here. CHAdeMO is just a footnote in the history here. But most of the large automakers that are currently using CCS are switching over to NACS. I can't envision a reason why the Chinese automakers would want to use anything but the standard that's already where we're going. Just the same way where they adopted Apple CarPlay and Android Auto in their infotainment systems, they're not going to put a roadblock in front of themselves. They're going to keep that car designed as seamlessly as possible to just integrate into our marketplace.
And they would have to create a whole new charging infrastructure if they wanted to change to a different plug, and it would have to overnight be as large or larger than all the NACS plugs in the Tesla supercharger network, and no one else is investing that kind of money in infrastructure.
Yep, that's right. Okay, well, we have just about a minute left. I noticed that Maricela posted in the chat the link to the paper, the white paper, so you can learn more. Again, automobilityadvisors.com. Really want to thank all of our participants. Hayden, Cap, Dan, Chip, Alan, thanks for your time today. Thanks for the good questions. Really happy to see all the good friends of AMA joining this Zoom call to learn a little bit more about EVs, and we will send the recording out later today. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.